do this event? How am I going to have conversations with people when there's no internet? So yeah, c'est la vie. But I'm glad it all worked out. I've got my producer here with me, Ben, who's helping coordinate a lot of the questions. So if you've got questions, please raise your hand in LinkedIn. We're using some streaming technology where I'm actually doing this through some other platform to LinkedIn, and it's being fed into LinkedIn. That's why Ben is going to be helping and managing on the LinkedIn side of the house. So to make sure everything kind of goes off smoothly. But yeah, had a big hurricane last week. Still cleaning up. Man, it was bad. Only a category 1, but there was just kind of a combination of events that made it much, much more disastrous than your average garden variety category 1. The biggest thing was what's called a king tide, which is basically a tide on a full moon, which usually will lift the high tides, another 4, 5, 6 feet anyway. So there was the king tide. The storm came directly from the east, and I'm on the East Coast, and we're a little bit north, and there's areas north of us, particularly like Daytona in and around there, where they were hit really, really hard. There's a lot of buildings that are kind of teetering on the edge of on the ocean. A lot of buildings just kind of got swept out completely, which isn't something you'd usually assume to get with a category 1 storm. But we're fine here, and just a lot of cleanup. So Ben, do we see any questions yet? I'm not seeing anything through my LinkedIn view, by the way, Ben. So if there are questions, please funnel them back through our video platform. In related news, related to data, I posted something on LinkedIn yesterday that's actually got quite a bit of traction, a lot of impressions. And a lot of interest, where I had a little bit of an aha kind of epiphany moment. It actually happened about 2 to 3 months ago, and I've just been thinking about it ever since. But I was still going to try to figure out, like, why do so many data governance programs fail? And the common wisdom, at least insofar as me as a Gartner analyst in the past, and kind of the prevailing mindset here among industry experts and analysts like me, is that one of the biggest drivers, of course, is that companies just don't quantify the business benefits of data governance. They find they're unable to be able to say that an X investment in data governance leads to a Y return on investment. I mean, that's kind of the big short answer here as to why data governance initiatives fail. There's a lot of other things. There's kind of knowledge gaps. There's lack of leadership. There's a lack of stakeholder engagement and buy-in. There's a whole bunch of things that contribute to governance failures. But the biggest one, if you ask me, consistently what I saw when I was at Gartner was an inability of businesses to be able to quantify business impacts from an ROI, from governance. But then I thought about it a little bit more. And I thought, okay, well, wait a minute. If that's true, there's got to be something else going on here, because not only are companies not having these numbers, but they're kind of willfully not doing the work, right? Like they're willfully kind of not putting in the effort to build the models, to invest in the resources or people or skills that would be needed in order to tie metrics from data quality and data governance and data management to business outcomes. They're just not doing it over and over and over again. I'd have these conversations when I was an analyst and say, do these things, and they wouldn't be done. And I was just really kind of struggling to figure out, well why? And I came to the conclusion that in part, one of the biggest reasons why is because there's an inversion. There's kind of a trade-off between where value is accrued for data governance and where the costs are born, right? And the more and more I thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense to me, which is costs for the most part of data governance. And what I mean by cost is like the overhead of managing data governance. That includes setting policies, defining policies, implementing the policies, and then managing the policies, right? And for the most part, that happens and it should happen for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, that happens at very, very functional levels of the organization, right? You've got data stewards that are sitting in sales operations or in finance, right? You've got You've got data analysts or lead stewards that are sitting within these organizations that are doing all of that work, that are sitting in meetings talking about how to define customers and access rules and retention policies and all these other things. These are happening at very kind of functional levels of the organization. And for certain data sets, it's every functional group is involved in that, particularly master data, right? Where you have to make decisions about how to define a customer. So you've got people at very functional levels, often which have day jobs, right? Who do other things for a living, right? Not just data governance, but you've got these people who are deeply enmeshed in defining policies and implementing and then managing them, making sure that people actually adhere to the data quality standards or adhere to any of the governance policies, right? Managing exceptions, managing change to all those things. It's a very functional thing. But when you kind of look at it, a lot of the greatest benefits, like not the only benefits, but some of the greatest benefits from data governance are occurring more at a cross-functional level, right? Where let's take risk, for example, right? If you're doing any sort of like GRC type governance, or you're doing any sort of management of risk related policies, the company itself, enterprise-wide, the corporation is really the one that is bearing the majority of the risk, because corporations are the ones that are going to get fined. Corporations are the ones that are going to be held liable for failing to comply with those compliance regulations. But the cost is at a very functional level. Now, of course, if an individual VP in sales or in finance or something does something contrary to the law, I assume that they would be, that there would be ramifications there from an employment perspective or otherwise. But the costs here are the benefit, I should say, of making sure that you are GRC compliant across the board. You are managing to all of your regulatory constraints. The real benefits there are accruing at higher levels of the organization, but the costs are being borne at very low levels of the organization. And I would argue that is true across the board. The more cross-functional data is, particularly master data, reference data, other data sets, the more kind of cross-functional it is, the more those benefits are accruing at higher levels of the organization. But again, the costs are down low, right? They're being borne by functional groups to manage that data governance. So that was my aha moment. That's what led to a post yesterday in LinkedIn where I said that it appears in many ways that there's a bit of a trade-off, right? Where benefits of governance are often at higher levels of the organization, but costs are at lower levels of the organization. What that would result in is functional leaders saying, I want more flexibility. I want more autonomy. I want to do things my way. I don't want to adhere to your rules or do things that are benefiting only you. And granted, of course, everybody works for the same companies, but I mean, I see fiefdom in large organizations all the time, right? Why am I having to do something that benefits somebody else over here? It's not part of my SLA. It's not part of my KPIs, right? I'm doing, I'm managing sales for sales. I'm not managing it for finance. So the more I thought about it, it was like this break between, who's paying and who's benefiting. And that would naturally lead to functional leaders kind of pushing back and saying, I don't want to do this. I want to do autonomy. I want to have more like maybe a data mesh type architecture where the things that I'm doing, the data I'm managing, the governance policies I'm managing are relevant really just only to me, right? And you can do that. You can most certainly do that. But if you were completely and totally and hyper federated from a data governance and data management perspective, the benefits really kind of largely stop at a functional level, right? Because you're going to have an awfully hard time realizing cross-functional benefits if you have for example, a customer data definition that only works for sales or only works for marketing, right? Or if you're managing relationships in your data that only work for a specific group. If you're managing other governance policies that only really work or only relevant or only pertain to one functional group, you're going to have a really hard time in realizing cross-functional benefits. And that's where the greatest benefit of MDM and data governance is. And data management, I would argue, is in those cross-functional spaces, right? In the gaps between function A and function B and holding them all together. That's where the greatest value is going to be, right? So if you take a hyper-federated approach to governance, if you really kind of push everything down to kind of functional levels, and we're seeing a lot of these pressures now, and I think a lot of this has to do with data mesh, not exclusively, and I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. I think some of the concepts are fantastic. But the more you kind of push things down from a data management and data governance perspective, that provides flexibility, it provides the autonomy. And then those business leaders, those functional leaders, fantastic. This is awesome. And then what I would see though is that the pendulum starts to swing back, because then all of a sudden you've got people at higher levels of the organization with relatively big titles saying, wait a minute, doing anything in a cross-functional basis is harder, right? Which could arguably lead to things like supply chain problems, like what we're experiencing now, or a lack of or have a totally inconsistent customer experience because maybe your customer data is not being widely shared because it's governed differently by functional units. Your services and support group may have a different functional definition of customer, different governance policies for customer that are experienced in sales or marketing, right? So you'd have senior leaders saying, well, wait a minute, this doesn't work. Why does it take me 2 weeks to pull a full customer report, right? Why is it taking me so long to get a complete 360 insight on my customers? Well, that's because our governance policies are very, very hyper federated. Well, who allowed that? Why? All right. I think I may be back. Knock, knock. Is this thing on? Horrible timing. I went through a hurricane and never lost internet. Not for a second. 3 days of like 80-mile-an-hour wind and nothing, no problem. And of course, this morning for my office hours, yeah, I've got internet problems. So, hey, Ben, in the chat, can you just confirm that you were up and live through LinkedIn? I'm going to assume that we are. I know that there is a pause between me asking that and you seeing it on LinkedIn. All right. Hooray. We seem to be back online. Okay. So I was on talking about a post I put on LinkedIn. I'll put a bow on that. I believe that there's a trade-off between the costs of data governance and the benefits of data governance. And that is what causes organizations to whipsaw back and forth, yo-yo back and forth between top down and bottom up over this kind of constant battle, shall we say, over who gets the benefit and who gets the cost. Awesome. But we did have a couple of questions come in when I was talking about my most recent LinkedIn post. The first question was, is the current functionalities have AI ML capabilities? Well, hold on. There's something missing there, Ben. All I see is a question from LinkedIn line. Is the current functionalities have AI ML capabilities? I'm not sure what the gist of that question is. Ben, maybe if you could repost that back through the public channel, that would be good. I just see, is the current functionality of AI ML? But when speaking about AI ML, I mean, it's a real thing in MDM. I would argue that most of the providers in the MDM space are kind of just early in their adoption of AI ML. I think that that's largely true for most of the providers. What Gartner would call augmented MDM is the use of AI, ML, graph, a few other kind of neat technologies in the MDM space. But I would argue we're really kind of early in the use of AI and ML. So what we're seeing are a few things like the use of AI and ML for automation of some data management tasks, like data modeling, for one, like data stewardship, where sometimes AI and ML can be used to help kind of inform data stewardship questions, or where you could actually be taking feedback from data stewards and using that to train ML models. So that if data stewards say, you know, one thing or these two things are a match, that there's an ML training process happening there, where the next time the pair is seen, that the ML can automate that process. There is some work underway within the space writ large for AI and ML to be used in a few other use cases, including entity resolution, aka matching, for AI and ML to be kind of leveraged to potentially derive or infer insights Yes, Graph is already doing that, but I think that there will be some kind of new advances there within the next, 6 to 12 months. But for the most part, I would argue that most MDM vendors are really kind of dipping their toe into the AI and ML pool, largely focused on trying to automate data management tasks, classification of data, profiling of data, modeling of data, and stewardship related tasks. That's kind of where most of the AI and ML efforts are being spent right now. Ben, if there are questions, yeah. Does MDM have AI and ML functions? Yes, it does. But again, some of the use cases here are fairly limited. Could we have a day where MDM and stewardship is like kind of fully automated, like the robots take over? No, I don't think that day will ever come, for a lot of different reasons. But I do see a future state where things do shift. Right now, I think we are at probably a 90-10, maybe even 95-5, meaning 90% of the rules, the configurations, the work, the modeling, the lifting of MDM, data governance, data management is being done by human beings, right? Where there are decisions being made about how to model data, about what relationships matter and how to structure taxonomies and hierarchies, about data governance policies writ large, right? How do I define a customer, right? I would argue that across the board, probably 90 to 95% of those decisions today are all being made by human beings, and that maybe 5 to 10% of the time, some of that work is being augmented or automated through AI and ML. Now, I could see a world in the future where that flips, right? Where we go to a world where machines are largely managing most of the rules and humans are managing the exceptions, right? Where that could just be from a stewardship perspective. It could also be from a modeling perspective. You name it. I think we could see it in maybe 7, 8, 9 years where it flips. But for now, AI and ML are they're adding value in the MDM space, but I would argue it's relatively limited. So no other questions on LinkedIn Live at the moment as of 11:35. Well, yeah, because I disappeared for 20 minutes. doesn't surprise me at all. So unfortunate. Like I said, I could survive a hurricane and not lose internet, but this morning, of course, I lost the internet. So Ben, but are there folks actually on the stream? Again, I can't see them through our platform, but are there folks on the LinkedIn event still? Some of the brave and courageous few have managed to stay through the evaporation of me. Are there still some folks there, Ben? All right. There's 8 brave attendees. That's fantastic. Well, ask some questions, guys. Or 9. Hey, woohoo. Ask anything that you want, right? Whether that's data governance related, data strategy related, MDM related, you name it. I mean, this time is for you. And kind of doubling back on why I'm here and why I'm even having this conversation. As many of you know, I was a Gartner analyst for almost 3 years, MDM, data governance. And a big part of really kind of my job at Gartner had 2 components to it. One was thought leadership, written thought leadership, AKA research. So like doing things like writing Magic Quadrant documents. And I'm proud that my name appears on 3 Magic Quadrant documents and other research, what Gartner calls notes, documents, insights, articles, right? That was a big part of my job, but it was really only about 30% of my job. The other 70% of my job was what Gartner calls client inquiries. So Gartner is a subscription-based business, and CIOs, CDOs, companies, VPs, data analytics, they subscribe to Gartner, and they pay a lot of money to subscribe to Gartner. And 70% of my time was having these things called inquiries, where CDOs, CIOs, VPs of data and analytics would call, and we would have WebEx conversations just like this. They were one-to-one, not one-to-many, But where they would ask questions like, hey, we're having a hard time getting an MDM program off the ground. Hey, these are our 5 or 6 top requirements for MDM. What sort of vendors do you see, meeting these requirements the best way? We've got some challenges related to data governance. What does the optimal data kind of management organization look like? Question, you name it. I would get questions across the board, day in and day out, from senior data and analytics leaders. And in these inquiries, I would give my advice. That advice came from, of course, now I'm almost like 30 years. It's kind of crazy to say that, almost 30 years in this space, but also came from all the other conversations that I was having, right? So I was having 5 of those a day, every day. Right. So I was having these conversations with data leaders, and in those conversations, I was figuring out what was working and what wasn't working, because they would share that with me. It was part of the conversation. I was like, okay, well, where are some of your challenges? What are some things that have actually been successes for you? What's working? And I would turn around and I would provide that to other people. And I would say, well, here's what we're seeing in your industry. So to make a long story short, guys, a big part of my job at Gartner was providing best practices, guidance, insight, recommendations to data leaders around the globe, and they were paying a lot of money for it. And now through Profisee, I can do this for an hour a month when I have internet, for an hour a month, and we're giving it away, right? And the whole goal here is to kind of raise the knowledge and awareness of the space writ large. We firmly and strongly believe that a rising tide will kind of lift all boats, meaning if we build awareness around MDM, if we build kind of skills and expertise in the MDM space, if I share what I know to everybody and as many people as I can, well, that's going to raise the bar for the entire MDM industry. And maybe people will end up coming to Profisee as a result. Of course, we hope so. But the real focus here is to act as a resource for the industry and to act as a resource for anybody who has questions about MDM or data governance. Because we want to be a trusted source of information for you. I want to be a trusted guide for you when it comes to MDM and governance, data strategy, you name it. So that's why we're doing this. Yes, I work for a software company and we sell software, of course. But the real goal here is to impart what I know to anybody who wants some of the insights that I have. So that's really kind of why we're doing this. We're taking the Gartner model, as it were, and I'm trying to push it now through Profisee, and we are giving away what folks used to pay a decent amount of money to experience vis-a-vis those inquiries with me. So would love to see any more questions, because if you don't, I will keep ranting about stuff. That sounds kind of threatening. Maybe the ranting is good. I don't know. I'm still working on my coffee. So Ben, I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and I've yet to see any more questions. So that's AI and ML. That kind of falls into the general bucket of what Gartner calls augmented MDM. It's really augmented MDM is and augmented data management, by the way. It's not just MDM. There's the concept of augmentation spans all data management disciplines, those being data governance, data quality, data integration, even BI and analytics. I think it would be silly to call data science augmented, because data science inherently already is. But the concept of augmentation kind of spans all data management disciplines. And it is the application of these new technologies to all of those disciplines. When we were, thanks Ben for the update. When this started to become a thing about 2 to 3 years ago, within the market, when AI ML graph really started to drive kind of differentiation in the space, meaning vendors that had it. Okay, cool. Vendors that had AI and ML capabilities in the data management space were driving a little competitive separation. And at Gartner, we're like, okay, well, we need to be paying attention here, and we need to be providing some insights to the market about what this means. So that was articulated in a lot of what Gartner calls their hype cycle documents. In the MDM space, augmented MDM was added to what's called their list of critical capabilities. So in terms of what Gartner calls an MDM solution, there are 13 capabilities that you need to have. One of them is augmented MDM. But interestingly, when that capability was added into the hype cycle, we decided to market obsolete before plateau. So if you guys are following anything on LinkedIn, there was a lot of flap recently when Gartner marked data mesh as obsolete before plateau on their hype cycle. What that means in Gartner speak is that concept, data mesh, and in my case, augmented MDM, because I also marked augmented MDM as obsolete before plateau. What that means is that capability, augmented MDM or data mesh, will never reach full market maturity. That something else will replace it, or it will be subsumed by something, or it will no longer be relevant before that technology reaches maturity, what Gartner calls the plateau of productivity, right? And the plateau, the kind of the hype cycle is a natural thing. We see this all the time, right? Where things get really, really hyped and they go up to the top and then they fall down into this thing called the trough of disillusionment. And then they move on their way to the plateau of productivity. And that's kind of the natural cycle of software, right? It's hyped. People question the value when it falls into the trough of disillusionment, and then all of a sudden full value is realized and it just becomes kind of, table stakes. Like that capability is something that's integrated, it's used. It's, for example, like CRM, right? CRM has gone through that whole cycle and is now on its way to the plateau of productivity, and other technologies have done that as well, right? So it doesn't mean that something is going to go away forever per se. In the case of the obsolete before plateau, what that means is that it'll just never get to that point. So from the perspective of augmented MDM, AI, ML, all these other things in the service of MDM, what I believe is that that'll just be how we do things, right? It will never, in another 3 to 4 years, we won't be calling it augmented MDM. We'll just call it MDM, and AI, graph, other cool new technologies will be deeply integrated into all the core capabilities of MDM. Data integration, workflow, stewardship, governance, right? Those are some of the core capabilities of MDM. AI and ML will be deeply integrated into all of them, at which point we'll no longer have to call it its own thing. It will no longer be, shall we say, worthy of its own critical capability in the space, right? So I call them augmented MDM obsolete before plateau, because I think it'll just be how MDM is done in another 3 to 4 years, right? I think it's going to be how all data management is done in another 3 to 4 years. We won't be calling augmented data quality or augmented governance. It'll just be done that way, right? Because it'll have to be done that way. And the reason why is because of the demands for scale and the demands for automation. What we're seeing in the data management space is that more and more and more and more data, there's more data than there ever has been before. We said that 5 years ago and it was true then. We said that 10 years ago and it was true then when we were talking about Hadoop and big data and all that other stuff. And it's true now. We have more and more and more and more data. And the scale required here, the automation required, is going to demand that AI and ML exists in our space. So is it going away? Did I say that augmented MDM is going to be obsolete? No. What I meant to say and is that it'll be just kind of part of the fabric. It'll be woven into how we do data management. So I think that's largely true of the data mesh as well, by the way. So yes, it's kind of these nuancy distinctions within the Gartner hype cycle, but hopefully that will help some understand why such a hot and new and exciting thing like augmented MDM or data mesh could be marked obsolete on a hype cycle. So hopefully that helped. No other questions, Ben? It's an ask me anything and nobody's asking me anything. Still no. Okay, sad. What else is going on in the world of data management? Well, speaking of the data mesh, I had a really awesome meetup 2 nights ago with Zamak, who is wrote the book on the data mesh. She was kind of the guest of honor, where we were able to ask some questions to Zamak about, anything. Basically, it was a session just like this, but where people were asking questions, and I was asking a lot of questions. It was really interesting. It's great. Without going into too much detail around the data mesh, to make a long story short, what I take away is that it's still very, very young, right? It's still very, very conceptual and very theoretical, right? And that even by Zamak's own admission, there's still a lot of work to be done here. And there are still a lot of situations where we don't have all the answers. One of those areas is, particularly from my perspective, I don't think Zhamak completely agrees with this, but from my perspective, one of the areas that is the biggest unknown is data governance, right? I think it's easy to say, hey, let's just hyper-federate everything. Let's be domain centric. Let's hire some domain product managers or product owners and have them manage data products at a domain level. Okay, that sounds great. Actually, I think there could be a lot of value to organizations there, right? But problems arise when you allow and you advocate for a governance model that allows for completely different ways of managing data, governing data at a domain level when you need cross-functional insights and when you need cross-functional governance, when you need cross-functional MDM, for example, customer, right? It's great that marketing can define a customer how marketing wants to define a customer. It's great that finance can define a customer how they want to define a customer. But if your CEO asks, how many customers do we have? There can only be one answer at that level. At that level. At an operating level, yeah, it's great. Maybe you can have multiple answers. Maybe marketing can have a view of the world that is completely different than the way that finance would look at the world. You can do that. And I think that's largely kind of what the data mesh is advocating, right? Where you have these product owners that are saying, okay, this is how I want to present analytics to marketing users, where maybe for that product owner, they decide that the best way to meet their user needs is to include sales leads as customers, for example, that would never be part of any sort of rev rec in a finance world, that would never ever make it onto a report that a CEO looks at when they're looking at, how much money did we make last quarter, right? So all companies need that cross-functional visibility. I mean, it's at the core of what MDM is, and it's at the core of what MDM does. It facilitates consistent definitions, taxonomies, structures, qualities, governance standards for shared data like customer. So I love the concept of the data mesh. I love the concept of data owners. I love the concept of product management injected at a data level and product management as a discipline writ large in the data space. I love that. I used to be a chief product officer. I managed a product team. So I think it is a great thing for the data and analytics world to have more product management as a discipline injected into data and analytics. Fantastic stuff. But again, if you need to look at the world cross-functionally, if you need to have one report, right, for that CEO to say, how many customers do we have? Well, you need to be prepared to answer that question. And my biggest concern with the data mesh is that the way to do that is really theoretical right now. Because in an extreme case, let's imagine you've got 20 domains, right? I'm just talking theoretically, 20 domains, right? Whether that domain is at a customer domain or maybe it's at a functional level, whatever the domain is, right? I think that the data mesh allows for flexibility in how to define a domain. But let's just say that we've got 20 domains with very, very different data governance rules in each of them, right? And then your CEO asks, how many things do we have, right? Whether it's a customer or it's a product or it's an IoT device or it's something, right? How many things do we have? How much do we spend on those things? How long does it take for us to make those things, right? If you need kind of cross-domain visibility, then how do you resolve all of those 20 differences that could potentially exist? Maybe they don't exist, but they could potentially exist. How do you resolve that? Even if you look at the data mesh through a correct lens of it being an analytical paradigm, this is something I think that is lost in a lot of the discussions about the data mesh, which is if you ask Zhamak, she will tell you this is kind of an analytical paradigm. This is about analytics. It's not about operational data. It's not about the data that is used to run machines, right? Or print invoices. This is about analytics, right? But even if you look at this purely from an analytics perspective, the issues of cross-domain consistency, cross-domain quality, right, are become really, really, really perplex very quickly if you do have complete and total domain autonomy, right? Because what I saw as a Gartner analyst for the better part of 3 years is companies struggling with one domain, right? Often that domain was an enterprise-wide domain where it was kind of the centralized top-down, but where they were struggling with governance policies just through the lens of enterprise-wide business rules, right? When you've got 20 domains, even if you assume that all of a sudden the company has the maturity, the governance maturity to define all the policies and procedures, all the rules that you need at a domain level, let's assume that you could do that. Let's assume that you've got product managers that data product managers that are pretty, understanding customer needs and understanding how to build the analytics and to ensure data quality and to ensure consistency and accuracy of the data at a domain level. Let's assume that they could do that. Still a stretch, but let's assume that they could do it. Then doing that times 20, right? And resolving all of those differences between them is really complex. So, data federation, local data management, domain-centric data management is fantastic until you start to need to figure out how to solve for that spider web, right? How to solve for enabling cross-functional visibility, cross-functional accuracy, data quality, data governance, so that you can have one answer to the question of how many customers do we have. Things could get really complex really, really quickly. And I think that is the biggest challenge with the data mesh, because I've been in those offices and those boardrooms. I've been the data and analytics leader where my CEO is looking at me and saying, why do I have two different answers for the same question? That I've been in that room. And I've been the guy where the finger's being pointed at, okay, well, something's wrong here. This report says one thing about how many customers we have, and this report says another thing. Which one do I trust? Right? And the answer is, well, it depends. Right? The first one is the marketing view of the world, and the next one is the rev rec view of the world. It's the finance view of the world. Right? But it depends is the worst possible answer you could give a CEO who's trying to understand the full breadth or depth of their relationship with a given customer. That's not the answer that you want to give, right? The answer you want to give is, we have 200 customers, and this is all the business we've ever done with Acme Incorporated, or all the business we've ever done with Joe Smith. Same thing is true, through any lens, whether that is a CEO lens, or maybe it's more of a functional lens, like your VP of marketing and wants to understand customer experience. Right? How many trouble tickets did this customer open in the last month? Well, it depends. It depends. Right? So I think there's a lot of kinks to be ironed out in the data mesh. Conceptually, I love the freedom and autonomy for data product managers to build and define and execute and manage products that are razor focused on their users, whether those users are internal or whether they're external. I love that, right? But I'm a little concerned that there's too much of a rush over to that world without also asking the question of, okay, wait a minute. One of our customers here is the CEO. Our customers are the executive suite, and kind of this fairly broadly defined notion of federated computational governance as defined within the data mesh, I see as being far more difficult than on paper it otherwise assume. So anyway, I'm a believer. I'm also a believer in the data fabric, by the way. So I think that both have a lot of validity in the data management space. I love the data mesh from the perspective of data product management, product owners. I love that idea, right? We desperately need more of that. And by the way, I would argue that if we were more product centric in the data and analytics space, data literacy really wouldn't be that important, right? This is an area, like data literacy is an area that I find particularly perplexing, because if I'm a product owner and I'm making like a durable good, let's say I made this little remote controller. That's what I did. And let's assume that I was the product manager for that. Let's assume that I launched that product. I put it into market, and we found out fairly quickly that the users couldn't use it. They didn't know how to use it. The instruction manual for all the buttons was incorrectly printed, or I failed to put in an instruction manual. I didn't launch any kind of training videos or how-to videos on YouTube. I didn't do all of the kind of basic blocking and tackling. And when the buttons did work, they didn't actually drive to the desired outcome. if that actually happened, and I was the product manager who made this thing and nobody bought it and my revenues were horrible and it was a complete flop in the market, if that happened to me as a product manager of this widget, would I say to myself, it's the users. They just don't get it. It's the users. They don't get it. And they need to be more literate in how to operate remote controls, something. No, I'd never say that. As a product manager, I would say, man, we missed the mark. We blew it, right? We didn't understand how the users were using the remote controls. We didn't understand, that what their desired outcomes for the remote control were. We missed it. We blew it. We missed the mark. Our market research was off, and we need to do a better job of understanding our customer needs. We need to understand our customer workflows. We need to understand what they like and what they don't like. We need to understand the user experience, their desired user experience. We need to understand all of those things before we build a widget. And turning around and saying, oh, well, man, the widget failed because the users, well, they're just not widget smart. Well, we'd never do that. So the concept of literacy, I like it, but I think this is what I like the most about the data mesh is that the notion of data product management. I think it's great. Anyway, we are at the top of the hour. For anybody that lasted while I vaporized for the good 15 or 20 minutes there, thank you to Spectrum Internet. Thank you for hanging out. I hope you got some little tidbits of value here. We'll do this again in another month. My apologies for the technical glitch. My hope is that we will see you again in another month. But if not, if you've got a question and you wanted it answered, just hit me up on LinkedIn or go to Profisee.com. We've got a ton of resources there, but send me a question on LinkedIn directly. Direct message me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer. All right, guys. Hopefully I will see you again in another month where I have internet. Thank you for being here.